Hello, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss, policy analyst at the Center for American Progress. With me today is Jamie Fly, Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. How are you today, Jamie?
I'm doing well. How are you, Matt?
Very well. Thanks for joining me. We have, we're going to be talking about Syria and Iran today. First, Wednesday, we saw a bombing in the National Security Building in Damascus. A number of top security officials killed and wounded, and I think I just saw that a fourth has now died. A pretty significant attack. It indicates, real the ability of the opposition forces to have infiltrated, the very top echelons of the Syrian security establishment. What do you think this means for the ongoing civil war, Jamie?
Well, my sense is that we're approaching a key moment in the conflict, and that I hope this is the case, that we're nearing the end of the Assad regime's reign in Syria. My understanding is there may even be reports that Assad has fled to the coast, that his wife may have fled the country. I believe there were some rebel gains in the immediate aftermath of the assassinations that might have been reversed this morning, at least in key parts of Damascus. But the bottom line, I think, is that it's increasingly clear that we're nearing the end of the regime, and the key question for me now is what role the United States is going to play in helping to shape the outcome. And I'm hoping that the Obama administration becomes more willing to take more aggressive action to help the opposition and to ensure that there's not complete chaos in the aftermath after Assad falls.
So looking back over, this uprising started in March of last year. It's been going on for almost a year and a half. I think many have been critical, perhaps you as well, of the way of what was seen as the lack of kind of overt involvement and intervention by the Obama administration. Looking back, not that we've reached the end of this by any means, but just looking back, do you think that the U.S. could have helped to shape this in a different way, or is that too hard to say?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that we could have helped to shape this in a different way. It's kind of ridiculous that as some of Assad's top lieutenants are assassinated, we have headlines in the Washington Post and other newspapers talking about the administration starts to look at shaping a post-Assad Syria. These are sorts of things that we should have been preparing plans for a year ago, or even more than a year ago, when it became clear that the uprising was not going to be quickly put down by Assad. And the administration, I think, at times has used some of the right rhetoric in talking about how we are on the side of the protesters and on the side of those who were peacefully advocating a change in Syria, but they haven't done much, as far as I can tell, to actually follow up on that, other than using rhetoric, other than pursuing diplomatic attempts at trying to mediate some sort of solution, which I think even that is very apparent from whether it was the Arab League efforts to Kofi Annan's plan leading up to the veto by Russia and China yesterday of the latest resolution at the Security Council, that those sorts of efforts have really gone nowhere. And I would have liked to see them last year get more aggressively involved, even perhaps look into some of the options like safe zones along the border with perhaps Lebanon and Turkey to provide a place for Syrian civilians who are fleeing the violence to seek safe haven, and find other ways that they could have perhaps helped prevent some of these thousands of deaths that have occurred. But at this point, we haven't been there as active as we could have been. We don't have as many ties to the opposition as we could have had if we had been there earlier supporting them. And so there's a real danger that there are going to be extremists, Salafists, and others who move in to fill this space, that al-Qaeda could take advantage of the situation and become even more active within Syria, even more active within a post-Assad Syria. You have chemical weapons now supposedly on the move that could potentially be used against the Syrian people, which would be catastrophic, or could get into the hands of terrorist groups like Hezbollah or even al-Qaeda. And that's something that I think not just Israel and Syria's neighbors should be concerned about, but we should be concerned about loose WMD as well.
Mm-hmm. mean, on the question of safe zones, I mean, that is, I mean, I think I often hear that term kind of thrown around. Okay, here's something we can do. I mean, but that is the beginning. It actually is a military intervention, right? I mean, because you need troops there, forces there to protect those safe zones. So I think, the problem as I've observed it, back to the beginning here, is that everyone has, obviously is against mass casualties, mass killing of civilians, but no one wants to be stuck with the aftermath, and everyone seems to be afraid that once you start getting involved here, you're just kind of you're on the hook for whatever happens after that.
No, I think that's a concern. The issue, especially early on last year, that was certainly, I think, a main reason, one of the main reasons that the administration was not more forceful. The fact of the matter is, now though, if you just look at the news accounts, you talk to some of the opposition, the rebels actually hold a significant amount of territory, especially outside the cities, and they hold much of the territory along some of these key border areas. Just today there were press reports about them actually taking over the official border checkpoints.
Right.
So it's my understanding that there are areas that are essentially liberated, and I've even seen press accounts from journalists who have snuck into Syria and reported that is the case. And so you have a rebel force that is already there on the ground that could provide the on-the-ground defense of safe zones. And the main thing that they've been asking for is air support in terms of a no-fly zone essentially, or a no-go zone, so that artillery, tanks, helicopters would not be used to basically overrun these pieces of territory. So I think there's a solution that could be found if the administration was interested in pursuing that with some of our partners like Turkey or Jordan. But they just, I think it's apparent that the administration doesn't want to get involved in Syria in an election year. The other issue is, I would argue that we're going to be stuck with the situation and the aftermath and the chaos in Syria, regardless of whether or not we are supporting safe zones. I mean, I think that's very apparent, just again with chemical weapons on the loose, with al-Qaeda playing a role in Syria, with some of these extremist groups trying to pursue their own agendas, along with the secular members of the FSA. So I think we're going to be stuck with the chaos and uncertainty in Syria, regardless of whether there's a military intervention. And I would argue that if there is some sort of intervention and a place where we can be on the ground, just like in Libya, you had Benghazi and the eastern part of the country as kind of an area where a transitional government could be established, where U.S. diplomats were working with the opposition, helping to shape the opposition, helping them to think through some notions of what the follow-on government would look like, what the kind of constitutional process would become. Right now that's very difficult because you have people in refugee camps across the border in Turkey, you have some in Lebanon, you have some of the expats in the United States and Europe, but the opposition has been somewhat fragmented. I think if there was a free Syrian territory that where all this planning could begin, as well as serve as perhaps a base for some other ways to get in aid, both non-lethal and some other assistance to the opposition, that it would really help give us a better leg up on the situation.
Right. I think that, 2 points here. First, it's right to note now that yes, the opposition forces do control territory. They've made some very significant gains, which I think significantly changes. It creates a new set of options for the U.S. and its partners. That's something that really just didn't exist a year ago, and I think it's I guess you can present a counterfactual where, okay, well, if the U.S. had gotten involved more overtly, it could have moved us faster to this outcome. It's possible. It's also possible that it could have gone completely a different way. But I would just say that the situation we have now is different, and I think argues for a more proactive engagement by the U.S. The second point on, as you said, the problem is that the opposition leadership is fragmented. It's unclear if you have, how long it will take before we see the makings of a new government.
I think that's very uncertain right now, and in large part because I don't think we've been willing to play the role that we should be playing and to help to build up the opposition. People forget that The Libyan opposition, even though Benghazi had been liberated, did not just spring up overnight. It took a lot of work. It took a lot of international assistance in terms of providing advice, to helping to bring together different factions. And I just don't get the sense that that has happened to the same extent in Syria. A lot of the problems too, and I have concerns. Even up until the assassinations this week, Secretary Clinton was still talking about some sort of mediation between regime elements and between opposition forces, and David Ignatius wrote that that was in part because the administration thought that was the safest way for this all to play out, that you would not have a complete regime collapse, but you could have perhaps talks between certain elements of the regime with the opposition, that there would be some sort of smoother transition that could result. I think that's just nonsense, given the thousands of deaths, given the way the regime has brutalized the Syrian people. I don't think we should expect at all that the opposition should want to sit down and talk to any elements of the regime at this point, unless they're actually willing to defect. And we have seen some high-level defections, but I think part of the problem is we've still been obsessed with this notion that there may be ways to have a negotiated settlement. Maybe Russia will pick up the phone to Vladimir Putin and tell Assad that it's time to go, and I think that it's increasingly apparent that that's just not going to happen.
I think that's probably right, but I wouldn't be so harsh on the idea of a negotiated solution. I mean, I think clearly for the top leaders, there really just has to be, they have to answer for these crimes. But I do think, I mean, looking at the example of Iraq, where you had, the entire state, basically, the entire bureaucracy moved out and just dismissed from power. I think it is in the interest of both the United States and the region and future Syria to try to come to some sort of deal where you don't end up with, the core of a new ongoing pro-Assad insurgency. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think that certainly elements of the military, and we've already seen this. I mean, the Free Syrian Army, where the momentum really is in terms of the opposition, the Syrian National Council, it's my understanding, is less relevant than it was 6 months or a year ago. The real momentum within the movement is amongst these military councils at a local basis inside the country, and most of them are made up of generals, colonels, and lower-level members of the military who have defected, so they essentially were working for the regime at one point. And so clearly you can have those sorts of, the sort of movement from people who were Syrian military officers to the opposition. But I think, again, a lot of the rhetoric, and certainly the Annan peace plan, and the efforts of other countries like Russia and China have focused on some sort of grand bargain happening with Syria's civilian political leadership, and I think that's nonsense. And at this point, especially, it's now clear that I think we're going to have probably a very bloody end to this, even once the regime is knocked out of power. Just again, the fact that you could have infiltrators get into key national security meetings, take out 4 of Assad's top lieutenants, I mean, just shows, I think, the way in which this whole thing is going to progress.
So we had yesterday Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah made one of his famous speeches, and really seemed just to as if there was any doubt. There certainly is no doubt now that he has thrown in his lot with Assad. Just hailing Assad as hailing that relationship, talking a lot about Assad's support for Hezbollah during the 2006 war, and I don't think it was really surprising that he would continue to support Assad. He's done that for a while, but I was surprised at how explicit he was about past Syrian support, but it really made clear the extent to which Hezbollah sees the survival of the Assad regime as an existential issue for them. What did you think?
No, I mean, I think, if I was a member of Hezbollah, if I was Iran right now, if I was sitting in Tehran as an Iranian leader, I would be very concerned about what is going on in Syria, because I think it's going to be an immense blow both to the Iranian regime as well as to groups like Hezbollah, even Hamas. I mean, for Hezbollah, they may have a lot of weapons that they've been able to stockpile. They may be able to, unfortunately, grab some additional capabilities hopefully not chemical weapons, but even conventional weapons as the Assad regime falls and some of the Syrian infrastructure falls apart and weapons depots are left unguarded, etc. And so they may temporarily have increased military capability, but I think it's going to make it more difficult for Iran to maintain that kind of lifeline to Hezbollah. And their options are going to be rather limited, especially if they are found to have been behind this terrorist attack against Israeli tourists in Bulgaria, for instance, or other provocations against Israel. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point there's, again, some conflict in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah forces, and they're not going to have Syria to help them resupply and provide a safe haven for their leaders, and they're going to have to be much more on the run than they've been in the past. And so, yeah, I think they're entering a very uncertain period.
I agree with most of that. You mentioned Hamas. I would just note, Hamas, for its own reasons, kind of bagged out on Assad months ago, right, and has worked pretty assiduously to reestablish ties or strengthen ties with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and other actors in the region. So it doesn't, we have this whole internal, external tension that's going on with the Hamas leadership, with the external leadership having decamped from Damascus, where they had been based for many years. But they seem to have kind of looked very quickly for new sponsors and new friends, and so that they don't seem to be as screwed as Hezbollah will be if Assad falls.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think they have other options, and they've perhaps showed some foresight when they moved their leadership out of Damascus. But I don't think Hezbollah is in that same situation. I'd be surprised if even countries like Egypt were willing to provide any real material support to a group like Hezbollah going forward.
Right. As would I. I do think it's worth noting, looking back at 2006, the 2006 Lebanon-Israel war, the war between Israel and Hezbollah after the soldiers were taken. I remember polls from that era placing, in the wake of Iraq, in the wake of that war, polls of the Arab world placing Nasrallah, Assad, and Ahmadinejad at the top in terms of people who, most favorite leaders. And now there was a recent poll that just showed that is completely gone. They are now the most reviled leaders. Now, it's hard to give any one actor or it seems to be largely a product of events. You've had the Arab awakening, and these are the leaders who've just been completely on the wrong side of this.
Yeah, and I think that, it makes a lot of sense. We've obviously also had the aftermath of the June 2009 elections in Iran and the way the Iranian regime has cracked down on the Iranian people since then. Right. And I think, again, whatever people of the region's views are of the United States or U.S. policy, the fact of the matter is, obviously, they are looking at other countries and what's happened in Egypt, what's happened in Yemen, Tunisia, Libya, and when they see a country like Iran helping to prop up Assad, helping to kill Syrian civilians, I think, and I'm glad that it changes perceptions of a regime like that in Tehran. Right.
So moving on to the bombing in Burgas, Bulgaria, also Wednesday. Is that correct? It was Wednesday.
Yeah, I believe it was also the same day.
Right. I think Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came out very quickly and laying blame on Iran. He was less aggressive in statements yesterday, but both Israeli and U.S. officials have indicated that Hezbollah and Iran were involved in this. The attack bore some of the. It was familiar. There was an attempt that was stopped in Cyprus earlier this month with a Lebanese man who admitted to be working with Hezbollah. So this bore some of the hallmarks of that attempted attack, which was intended to be against Israeli tourists in Cyprus. So they haven't released any intelligence or shown any proof, but they've both made statements that they believe Iran and Hezbollah to be behind this. And I think this is, obviously it's horrible because humans were killed, but in terms of what this says about the new audacity of Hezbollah and Iran, not just killing tourists, but killing tourists in Europe. There's that, but then in turn, it also seems like it could be just a really, really stupid move if you're trying to if you're trying to split up the European Union, which has has a new oil embargo on Iran. This seems like the worst possible thing you could do at the worst possible time.
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, I'd actually be interested in hearing your thoughts about how this maybe perhaps changes your sense of what Iran's actual interests are in this process of negotiations we're still engaged in over the nuclear program, and whether you think that they're actually serious about changing their behavior. I mean, it's the track record, even beyond what you mentioned in the most recent months. Obviously, there have also been reports about terrorist attacks being plotted against U.S. diplomats in Azerbaijan. You had the planning for an attack, an assassination of the Saudi ambassador here in Washington. And so I think it's clear that Iran has no intention anytime soon, at least certainly on the terrorism side, in dialing back its activities, and it actually seems to be doing quite the opposite. And my my long-held belief is that says a lot about the nature of the regime itself, and whether and what their long-term intentions are, and whether we can even trust them to negotiate in good faith on the nuclear program. Which I would just say, I believe there's another round of talks next week. Despite the four or maybe 3 or 4 meetings we've had in the last several months, I haven't seen a whole lot of progress out of the talks thus far.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, my view is that Iran, again, this is not certainly to justify, but my view of Iran's view is that they feel that they've been under attack. Their scientists have been assassinated. Their centrifuges have been destroyed by the Stuxnet worm. And I've seen this mentioned in a number of reports that they see this as a sort of tit for tat thing with the Israelis. Now, obviously, there's no defense of attacking civilian tourists at all. So this does seem to be a new sort of escalation. Looking at the talks, I think obviously we didn't come to an agreement, but I think there was a consensus within the P5+1, as I understood it, that Iran was engaging on the nuclear issue, beginning in Istanbul and continuing into Baghdad. They were engaging on the issue in a way that they hadn't. The speech making was kept to a fair minimum. They were talking about serious issues, but the fact remained that they had demands and were not willing to go as far as the P5+1 wanted them to. The gaps were large, as they say. You can say this is a stalling tactic. I think there's an element of that to it. But they see their demands. They see that they insist that they have a right to enrich domestically. The P5+1 is not so sure. But as to what these attacks say about Iran's willingness to come to some kind of a deal, I don't know. Does the attack in Bulgaria, if in fact it was Iran behind it, does that suggest that Iran was not serious about shipping out its 20% enriched uranium? I don't know.
I think what it says is we're dealing with a country that's not willing to respect international norms of behavior, and I think it's fairly clear that the Iranians aren't serious about shipping out the 20%, but even if they were, that's not going to solve the Iranian nuclear problem. It's just a placeholder. It's a way to kick the can down the road a little bit. In general, I mean, I think that what the offers, my understanding is, that have been made by the P5+1 to Iran are very generous and would provide Iran, and this even goes back to the Bush administration, which made clear along with the P5+1 years ago that Iran could be provided with all of the fuel it would need for reactors for a civilian nuclear program. The problem that, I mean, they don't even seem interested in engaging on the issue of some sort of limited enrichment capability in country, which has been floated by outside experts for years. But the problem with that is that situation only makes sense if you have enough safeguards and you have enough trust between the parties that you can assume that Iran will not exploit that arrangement at some point to pursue a covert program. And given the reality that they have constantly been violating their international commitments in this area and constantly gone back on their agreements with the international community, I think it's very difficult to argue in favor of even that sort of solution. And that's a very forward-leaning approach, which I've never even seen Iran express much interest in either. So I have very little hope that these talks are going to get us anywhere. And I would argue, I mean, the more we stand back and do not respond, we or Israel respond forcefully to these sorts of attacks, it really just encourages, I think, those within Iran who are propagating these sorts of terrorist attacks to feel that they have free rein to push the envelope even further.
Well, on the question of international norms, is it within international norms to assassinate Iranian scientists? I mean, I'd say that, the U.S. and Israel in various ways have been responding forcefully, perhaps not overtly militarily, but they have been responding, and I think that's perceived quite well in Iran.
Well, I think you could ask the same question about then if that's how you want to phrase the issue or talk about the issue of assassinating nuclear scientists. Is it within international norms to be assassinating someone traveling down a road in Yemen? I think we in the U.S. government, the Obama administration, has come to the conclusion that we're essentially in a state of war with al-Qaeda, and we thus have a variety of options that we can pursue to deal with those threats. I think if you look at the Israeli situation, I think there's broad consensus within Israel that Israel is essentially at some sort of state of war with Iran, and it goes even back much further than the nuclear program, because Iran has been propagating these sorts of attacks against Israel, Israeli citizens, American soldiers now for years. And so, I understand that Iran does not like it when nuclear scientists are blown up, but they're pursuing a covert nuclear weapons program and doing work that Iran has agreed under the NPT to not do.
No, I'm sorry, I just don't buy this equivalence between members of al-Qaeda and Iranian nuclear scientists. I mean, I have my own issues. I mean, I think there are questions about, the ongoing use of drone attacks and cruise missile attacks on members of al-Qaeda, but I would make a real distinction. I mean, there is, to say, a member of al-Qaeda who has declared war against the United States and an Iranian nuclear scientist, I mean, you just say straight out that they are pursuing a nuclear weapons program. I mean, that is not what the U.S. intelligence community says. Yes, there are serious questions. Yes, the IAEA has a set of questions that Iran has yet to answer, and I think it's important to note that. But simply to say straight out, well, Iran has a nuclear weapons program and Israel can't deal with that, so they're justified in killing these scientists, I don't think that's supportable.
Well, I think the issue, it depends on where you sit. I mean, if you were sitting in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, I mean, you view the threat from Iran differently than us sitting here in Washington. And I'm not saying, obviously, I think there's no evidence, and I'd be shocked if the United States had anything to do with the assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists. But I think if you're sitting in Israel, I mean, Israel may not feel directly threatened by al-Qaeda, but they do feel directly threatened by Iran, and so who knows what their legal findings are for their system is similar to ours. I'm sure they have justifications for doing this, just like we do for going after al-Qaeda, members of al-Qaeda wherever they reside in Somalia, Yemen, the tribal regions of Pakistan, even outside what have been traditionally characterized as war zones. But I think it's difficult. I understand your point from an American perspective, and again, I don't think there's any evidence that the United States has been involved in assassinating Iranians. I would actually argue that, setting aside the nuclear program, but there is a case to be made, given what Iran has done to our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, that we should have taken more forceful actions, even inside Iran, with some special forces raids against some of the depots that were supplying Shiite militias in Iraq, or supplying some of the IEDs that still from time to time are coming into Afghanistan. and I think the American people in general would agree with that. I don't think most of them want to see our soldiers getting killed by snipers and IEDs that have either been trained or supplied by Iran, and I think they would understand if forceful action was required. And so I think it really comes down to where you sit and what your perspectives are given your location.
Right. No, I mean, I certainly grant that Israelis see this as a much more urgent issue. There's no question there. But I think if we are talking about international norms, if it can be left up to the Israelis to determine that this is an existential threat, and despite the fact that the IAEA has not come right out and said that Iran has a nuclear weapons program, that aside, that Israel can make this determination and go after nuclear scientists and kill them themselves. And I think that raises, what if Russia made similar decisions about people it determined to threaten them? What if China made similar decisions? It's not hard for me to see how, you can keep going with this, and everybody's making these determinations on their own and taking out people they perceive as a threat. And what happens to international norms then?
No, I mean, I would argue, Russia and China unfortunately already do these sorts of things as well. I mean, there's plenty of cases where Russia, and especially Russia, I'm sure China as well, have gone after expatriates or dissidents or others that they feel threaten the state. I'm obviously not condoning that. It's in the intelligence world, these sorts of operations happen all the time. It's just rare in this case because of Iran and the attention the nuclear program receives. It's received a lot of coverage. I would point out I'm agnostic on the case on the issue of assassinations of nuclear scientists. I'm not opposed to it. I actually don't think it's that effective in slowing down the nuclear program, and that's my view about a lot of the reported programs in David Sanger's book and elsewhere. I think just the facts have shown that those are measures that may gain you a little bit of time, but they haven't in general been all that useful. And I guess my response to you in all of this is, especially for those who are opposed and fundamentally opposed to what Israel has been doing with these assassinations. My guess is Israel is doing this because they really want to avoid a military conflict with Iran. They are holding that out, the military option, as a last resort. And I assume you would prefer to see them pursuing these sorts of covert strategies rather than sending their F-16s over Natanz and go.
No, right. That's a good point, and I would. If it's a choice between this and all-out war, then sure. I brought up the assassinations just to respond to the point that you raised about Iran acting outside of international norms, just to say, okay, you can point out ways in which this goes both ways.
Yeah, I think the major difference when it comes to the international norms issue is Iran has a track record of funding and supporting and supplying terrorist groups that routinely kill civilians and do so around the world. People of multiple nationalities, not just Israelis, but also Americans, also Europeans, and has no qualms about doing so. It's a policy of their state, fully supported by the regime. And anything that Israel may or may not have been doing is clearly targeted at people who are working for the Iranian government on a program that I would argue is a covert nuclear weapons program, regardless of what the IAEA has been able to find out or not. Those Iranian scientists that are doing sensitive nuclear work, they completely realize what they're doing. They realize that this is not for peaceful purposes. They realize that this is not some run-of-the-mill day job that they go to. Many of them have dedicated their careers to helping Iran get a nuclear weapon. And so I would not even, yes, sometimes I think in one or two cases, maybe a spouse of one of the scientists was also killed along with the scientist, but I find it hard to believe that you can argue that these are just innocents that have been kind of swept up into something that they never anticipated getting involved in. And so I do think it's very different than the standard operating procedure of Iran and its terrorist proxies.
I would agree with most of that. On one last point before we finish up, as I've been reading about the Bulgaria attacks and the possible range of responses, I was reminded of an interview with Roya Hakakian. Do you know the Iranian dissident?
Yeah.
There was a great interview with her in the Washington Post a few months ago, maybe last year. I think it was last year, where she talks about her new book in which she writes about the terror attack in Berlin by the Iranian Quds Force against Kurdish Iranian dissidents, and the way that was treated. That was actually. There was a German prosecutor who pursued that very, very vigorously as a legal criminal process, winning a case against Iran in 1997, and which resulted in Germany for a time suspending relations with Iran, massive international condemnation, an immediate end to Iranian terrorist activity in Europe. And she presents this, I think, rightly as an important victory. I mean, I think it's not wrong to consider other options, but I do think it's very much worth noting when you do something like that, pursuing it very much within the bounds or within the context of international legality, and you end up with massive international condemnation. I think that's something that Iran has shown that bothers them, and they do change their behavior, if only for a short time. I mean, my point being here that using this as yet another ratchet on the international pressure against the Iranian regime, further isolation. As I mentioned before, I mean, this pretty much guarantees that you're going to have a strong EU oil embargo against Iran for the medium term at least. So rather than using this as a sort of pretext for amping up military action, either covert or overt, using this just to further clamp down on Iran, both economically and sort of morally and politically.
I would generally agree with that. I think what I have read Roya's book, and I think the part of the story, though, that you hinted at, but it took years for that prosecution, and the German prosecutor, who certainly should be commended, had to really put his career on the line. Ran into severe political problems within Germany, pressure from the German government to not investigate. They did not want to offend the Iranian government. Now I think the situation vis-a-vis Iran, fortunately, has shifted somewhat in that the international community is probably much more willing to condemn Iran today than they were at that point. However, I fully agree that all of these cases should be pursued in that way, and I'm sure there'll be investigations in Bulgaria, just as I think there were some indictments in the case of the plot against the Saudi ambassador here in Washington. The problem is, in most of these cases, there's been some veiled threats from the Obama administration, at least in the case of the Saudi ambassador plot. There was talk of going to a lot of our allies in the international community and trying to get some sort of ban on Iranian diplomats or Iranian officials traveling to Europe and elsewhere. I think that went nowhere. My general concern about sanctions is I think we're really running out of options. We've had a severe impact on the Iranian economy, but we really have not changed the calculus of the regime, certainly on the nuclear program, but I would argue, just look again at these actions. These are increasing. The pace of these sorts of plots and attacks are becoming much more regular, which is concerning. And so whatever we have been doing thus far has not been successful. And I'm a little skeptical that our government or most of our European friends are going to be willing to be all that much tougher. And it's very difficult to be tough on the terrorism issue when you're sitting across from the Iranians in Geneva or Moscow or Baghdad, and every 2 weeks you're having negotiations. And so I think that's part of the problem as well. The Iranians realize that we're not entirely serious about all of this, because I think they realize the Obama administration doesn't want to pursue military action. I think they realize that the Europeans are desperate for negotiated settlement. I think they realize the Russians and Chinese are desperate for negotiations to go well, and I think the Iranians feel that provides them a certain amount of freedom to conduct these sorts of attacks.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have to wonder about that. Is it just not possible to continue to talk to the Iranians about the nuclear program while making clear to them that we're going to pursue and stop these and do our utmost to pursue the people responsible for these attacks?
Well, I mean, the
Can't-
people
you-
responsible for these attacks, I mean, the other aspect of, I think, where the case in Berlin went is you can round up, in that case, they actually captured some of the assassination team that had not been able to flee the country. A number of them had fled and got back to Iran. You can only round up the low-level operatives who maybe helped facilitate, especially in the case of a suicide bombing, you can only help round up anyone who might have helped the bomber on the ground in Bulgaria, or if there was a staging area in some other Western nation. The trail quickly leads back to downtown Tehran, to the Ministry of Intelligence, I'm sure, or to the Quds Force, or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. You can't. There's never going to be an extradition request sent to Iran for an intelligence official or a military official, and no one's going to demand that the supreme leader be extradited to Bulgaria for trial. And so you get back to fundamental questions that you and I have debated many times before. It really goes back to the nature of the regime, and we're going to continue to see these sorts of actions by Iran as long as you have this clerical regime in power.
All right. Well, thanks, Jamie. This was really interesting. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Great. Thanks, Matt.
All right.